For decades, Americans were told a simple story. Wherever you go in the world, people admire you, envy you, want to be like you. But what happens when Americans finally step outside their borders and discover that story no longer matches reality? Welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, please subscribe, like my video, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next update. In recent years, a strange and uncomfortable realization has been spreading across social media, travel vlogs, online forums, and comment sections. Americans traveling abroad, working overseas, or even just talking to people from other countries are running into something they weren't prepared for. The admiration they expected isn't always there. The automatic goodwill they assumed doesn't always exist. And sometimes, instead of being welcomed, they're met with skepticism, criticism, or even open hostility. This isn't about Americans suddenly being hated everywhere they go. It's something more complex, more uncomfortable, and far more revealing. It's about a global shift in perception and how millions of Americans are being shocked to find out that the world's relationship with the United States has fundamentally changed. To understand why this feels so jarring, we have to go back to a time when America's image abroad was very different. For much of the 20th century, the United States occupied a unique place in the global imagination. To people in war-torn countries, America represented safety and power. To those living under authoritarian regimes, it symbolized freedom and opportunity. Hollywood movies, American music, and television shows carried images of confidence, wealth, and possibility into homes all over the world. For immigrants, America was the promised land. For allies, it was the protector. For rivals, it was the standard they measured themselves against. Even people who disagreed with American policies often separated those disagreements from their feelings about Americans themselves. This admiration wasn't accidental. It was reinforced through culture, economics, and influence. American brands dominated global markets. American universities attracted the brightest minds. American passports opened doors. And inside the United States, generations grew up hearing a consistent message: the world looks up to you. That belief became deeply ingrained. Many Americans never questioned it because they didn't need to. The evidence seemed to be everywhere. Until, slowly, it wasn't. The change didn't happen overnight. It unfolded gradually, over years, through a series of global events that reshaped how the world viewed American power and American behavior. Long foreign wars began to erode the image of the U.S. as a stabilizing force. Political divisions played out on the world stage in increasingly visible ways. Social media made American domestic conflicts impossible to ignore. Every protest, every controversial policy, every viral clip was no longer filtered through diplomats or news anchors. It was broadcast raw, in real time, to the entire planet. At the same time, other countries grew more confident in their own identities. They no longer needed to measure themselves against America to feel successful. Economic power diversified. Cultural influence spread in new directions. The world became less centered on one dominant voice. And yet, inside the U.S., the old story continued. Many Americans still believed the world saw them as leaders by default. So when reality began to contradict that belief, the shock was intense. For many Americans, the realization comes during travel. It might be a casual conversation that suddenly turns awkward, a joke that doesn't land, a question about politics that carries an edge, or a quiet shift in tone when someone hears their accent. Travel vloggers have documented it openly. Americans describing how they felt invisible, misunderstood, or judged in places they expected admiration. Some admit they were surprised to find that locals knew far more about U.S. politics than they did about the host country. Others describe being associated with stereotypes they didn't recognize as their own. In Europe, some Americans encounter frustration with what's perceived as arrogance or ignorance. In parts of Asia, they're seen as loud, entitled, or overly political. In Africa and Latin America, the history of U.S. intervention complicates how Americans are viewed, even when individuals had nothing to do with those decisions. This is where the shock sets in, not because Americans are universally disliked, but because they're no longer automatically admired. What's more unsettling, being openly disliked, or realizing that the respect you assumed was never guaranteed in the first place? To many outside the U.S., America now appears contradictory. It preaches freedom but seems internally divided. It promotes democracy while struggling with trust in its own institutions. It exports culture faster than it listens to criticism. This perception doesn't come from one event or one administration. It's cumulative. It's shaped by headlines, viral videos, political rhetoric, and personal interactions with Americans abroad. In some countries, America is seen as powerful but unstable. In others, influential but out of touch. And in many places, there's a growing sense that America no longer understands how it's perceived. This isn't unique to the US. Every global power eventually faces backlash. What makes this moment different is how unprepared many Americans are for it. When Americans confront this shift, the reactions vary widely. What does thinks big, my dear? Some respond with disbelief. They dismiss criticism as jealousy or misinformation. Others become defensive, insisting that the world still relies on the US whether it likes it or not. But there's another group that reacts with curiosity. They start asking questions. Why do people feel this way? What role did American culture play? How much of this perception is deserved and how much is exaggerated? Online, this conversation is exploding. Comment sections fill with Americans expressing shock at being criticized abroad. Others share stories of learning humility through travel. Some admit they never realized how US-centric their worldview had been until it was challenged. This moment, uncomfortable as it is forcing a kind of reckoning. Here's where the narrative often goes wrong. It's easy to frame this as the world hating America, but that oversimplifies what's actually happening. Much of what Americans are encountering isn't hatred. It's fatigue. Fatigue with dominance. Fatigue with moral lectures. Fatigue with being affected by decisions made thousands of miles away. In many cases, people don't dislike Americans as individuals. They dislike what America represents in global systems of power, and when Americans don't recognize that distinction, misunderstandings deepen. This is why some Americans abroad feel blindsided. They expect personal interactions to be separate from politics, while others see those things as inseparable. If the roles were reversed, would Americans feel differently about a country that dominated global culture, economics, and military power for decades? Media plays a massive role in shaping these perceptions. American media exports not just entertainment, but behavior. Reality shows, social media influencers, and viral clips often highlight the loudest, most extreme versions of American life. To viewers abroad, these images don't feel like exceptions. They feel like representations. And when Americans insist that those images don't reflect reality, it clashes with what the world sees daily on their screens. Stereotypes form in that gap. Americans are seen as self-centered, uninformed, or culturally insensitive. These stereotypes aren't fair, but they didn't appear out of nowhere. And once stereotypes take hold, they're hard to undo. Interestingly, younger Americans often experience this shift differently. Many are more globally connected, more exposed to international perspectives, and more aware of how America is viewed abroad. Older generations, raised during America's unchallenged dominance, tend to feel the shock more acutely. For them, this feels like a loss of status, not just a change in perception. This generational divide fuels internal conflict. Some see global criticism as an attack. Others see it as an opportunity to listen and adapt. At its core, this isn't a story about Americans being rejected. It's a story about a world that no longer revolves around a single narrative. The US is still powerful, still influential, still admired in many ways. But admiration is no longer automatic. Respect is no longer guaranteed. And that shift forces Americans to engage with the world differently. For some, that's frightening. For others, it's liberating. So what happens when Americans accept this new reality? One path leads to defensiveness, isolation, and resentment. The other leads to humility, curiosity, and stronger global relationships. The choice isn't being made by governments alone. It's being made by everyday Americans in conversations, classrooms, workplaces, and travels abroad. The world hasn't stopped watching America. But it's watching with clearer eyes now. And perhaps the biggest shock isn't that the world doesn't love America anymore. It's that love was never the point. The real question is this. Now that the illusion is gone, what kind of relationship does America want with the rest of the world? And more importantly, are Americans ready to listen to the answer? Have you ever experienced this shift firsthand, either as an American abroad or as someone interacting with Americans? Share your perspective in the comments. This conversation is far bigger than that.